of the volumes I'm particularly pleased to possess was actually printed round about 1560. It's this particular title, The Commentario, by a man called John Sladen. As was the custom of the time, his name was often put into Latin as Johannes Sladanus, and it was first published in 1555, but there were many other editions subsequently. John Sladen was born round about 1500, and he actually died round about 1556. He was a major scholar who studied a wide range of disciplines, such as, example, the ancient languages and literature, and also jurisprudence as well in other universities. He became particularly interested in the history of his own times, though, particularly in the religious history of his own century, and in particular, of course, the history of what had happened in the aftermath of Luther's 1517 revolution, in a sense, that Luther launched when he either glued or some say nailed, but certainly publicised a range of controversial theological questions, theses, supposedly on the church door of his small German town, Wittenberg, which also had a small German university at which he was employed. Sladen became, well, one could say, dominated by the urge to collect as much as possible of the documentary evidence of everything that had happened in the aftermath of that October 1517 launch of Luther's challenge to the Orthodox Church of Rome. He not only visited libraries and archives wherever he could access them throughout Europe, because he was a diplomat and could get access to many countries. He also made copies, of course, but he also sought to collect original documents wherever possible. And such was the archive which he personally accumulated that eventually it was suggested to the Protestant powers in Europe, who were obviously in the minority, that Sladen should be made their official historian. Partly because he had so much material at his disposal, but also because he was regarded as such an eminent scholar and fair-minded author. Anyway, the Protestant head honchos agreed at this and promised him money and additional access to documents. He may have got access to the documents. Regrettably, very little of the money was ever forthcoming. He did, in fact, attempt to tap the court of England for finance, and the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time promised him funds. Once again, promises, promises, promises. No cash was ever forthcoming. So, against all odds, Sladen carried on with his intensive researches, his extensive writing, interrupted by diplomatic appointments and commissions, one of which included an actual visit to Henry VIII's court in England, and carried on drafting and writing until the first volume of his sort of history of the Protestant Reformation was published around about 1545. he published the last segment around about 1555. Regrettably, worn out and even more, unfortunately, poverty-stricken by this stage of the game, he died a year later. The key importance of Sladen's work is that for his historically minded contemporaries, he provided an overarching account and coherent explanation for what each of his contemporaries had experienced, often in small minor details, without being able to put their own personal experience into the wider meaning of the revolutionary period through which they were living. Sladen provided for his Protestant contemporaries and for his critical Catholic readership, who were also avid purchasers of his books, an explanation and a justification for the Protestant rejection of what was seen as the centuries on centuries accumulation of the superstitions and abuses and distortions which had cumulatively grown under successive papacies of the Church of Rome. In practice, the Protestants tended to trace these abuses and superstitions and distortions of scriptural accuracy back as far as the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine gave the Church privileged status within his empire. And as Lord Acton, a Catholic historian, so vividly and succinctly remarked in the 19th century, all power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Anyway, Sladen published this historical justification of the Protestant point of view, and also as far as the Protestant governments were concerned, the monarchs particularly, he fully justified their disinclination to obey what was known as the Roman Emperor. This isn't the same thing as the Roman Pope. The Roman Emperor was an entirely different institution in the 16th century. However, the Roman Emperor, who was often a German, though frequently a Spaniard, was certainly an orthodox, true blue, dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, who wouldn't go against anything that the papacy wanted. Obviously, the Protestant governments, the monarchs, were not inclined to go along with anything that the Roman Empire or the religious Roman Empire of the papacy that they wanted. Such was the significance of Sladen's work that something in the region of 95 editions of his work were published between 1555 and 1660. There was a large quantity in Latin, a very large number in German, quite a few in French, regrettably, but predictably, only one in Italian, and also only one in English. The key thing about Sladen, though, was that he radically transformed the method of writing history, because what he did was effectively show the way to a new procedure of organising an historical account, what's officially known as historiography, effectively the theory of writing history. He extensively investigated original documents in archives. He quoted directly from the writings or from the recorded words of the participants who were involved during this extensive period. In other words, put it crudely, he went straight to the horse's mouth. He evidenced his every claim by notes in the margin of his pages, saying where a particular source was to be found, which would evidence the claim that he made. He was also a contributor to a vast historical enterprise known colloquially, if such thing is colloquial, as the Magdeburg Centuries. A group of Protestant scholars decided to write a history of the church from the year dot, basically, in other words, the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, year zero. And they wrote it in 100-year portions per volume, i.e. a century. They got as far as the 13th volume, i.e. the end of the 13th century. But what made their work so revolutionary and so significant a model to follow for later historians was that they ransacked the libraries and archives of virtually every major city and town and monastery and etc. in Western Europe in order to lay their hands on the original documents or the contemporary accounts of the events they were describing. So for the first time, you were getting what could be called almost reliable history. I say almost because the past is very much an unknown place. We can never be certain what went on there or why a particular individual was motivated to a particular action. Nevertheless, the authors of the Magdeburg Centuries and Sladen as a contributor to their early volumes and as the author of this book, which is beautifully printed 460 years later. The paper is still very clean and white, no age browning, hardly any foxing. The type is beautifully set evenly across the page. There's only a small amount of ink underlinings and notes in the margins. All in all, it is a prime example of the craftsmanship of the scholar printers of the period. Originally it was published in a large folio volume, and that folio volume can be 12 inches tall, can be 15 inches tall. The elephant folios can go to 19 inches, and that means, of course, 10 inches or even 12 inches wide. Not the kind of thing you have on your duvet for bedtime reading. So this is why smaller versions, handily slipped in the pocket, but also, of course, handily hidden from wider view, just in case it was being owned in one of the territories ruled by a Catholic monarch, where the mere possession of a volume like this could get you sent before the Catholic Inquisition, could get you imprisoned, could get you extensively subject to various tortures, and could even, if you were found guilty of unrepentant heresy, could get you burned publicly at the stake in a public ritual of horrendous pain and suffering for the participant, obviously, but also for their friends and family who are watching. Essentially, Sladen's book was widely used by later Protestant historians as the basis on which to effectively form the rough draft of their own later editions and reinterpretations of what had happened in that period from 1517 through to roughly the mid-1560s.